how is it possibly just for Elisha the prophet to call down bears to maul 42 children? Did the Bible permit Israel to take sex slaves from nations they defeated in war? These are just a couple of the tough questions we are going to explore today with our guest, Dr. Paul Copan, author of an upcoming book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? If you're not familiar with Dr. Paul Copan, you need to get familiar with him very quickly. He's a professor, he's a philosopher, one of the leading apologists today, author of multiple books, and has really established himself as one of the experts willing to take on some of the toughest, thorniest, most challenging passages in the Old Testament and defend what we would consider the historic Christian faith. Paul, love your writing, willingness to come on. We love partnering with you at Biola. We got to get you over to teach a class where you walk through these. Our students in our grad program would absolutely love it. Now, here's what we're going to do. You're giving us kind of the first glimpse of your book that at the time of this recording is not released yet. We are going to come back live on Friday, September 30th at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's 1 week from when this is releasing. And if there are objections you have to some of Paul's responses or issues in the Old Testament we did address, write them in the comments. We're not shying away from any difficult issues, and we will talk about them. So all of your comments are welcome, but write question in caps and make it as succinct as possible. We will gather these and then again, mark your calendar next Friday, September 30th, which is 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to come live. Paul, thanks for carving out time to join us today to talk about this.
Absolutely, Sean. Great to be with you.
Well, we're going to jump into these difficult passages, but one of the things that is important is you have a methodology and an approach that shapes some of the answers that you give. So we've got to spend a little bit of time unpacking your unique approach before we get to these passages specifically. So maybe just start off by telling us, how is this book, Is God a Vindictive Bully, different from your earlier book, Is God a Moral Monster?
I try to give new material insofar as I'm able, but sometimes I'll build on what I've discussed before. I cover new swaths of material like Elisha and the bears, the firstborn of Egypt, the flood of Noah, the imprecatory Psalms, etc. I also look at the issues of women, servitude, and warfare in much more expanded ways. And also, I think, a number of new insights that I think the readers will find very helpful. I'm also looking at how is the law of Moses formed, looking at issues of, in particular, as I talk about critics from without and critics from within, that there are people from outside the church who are launching attacks against the Old Testament. And then there are those who are from within the church who are also taking another look at these challenging, severe passages of the Old Testament and saying, did God really say that when it says, thus says the Lord? Maybe he didn't. And so I'm pushing back on some of those, saying, no, when it says, this is what the Lord says, this is what the Lord says. And so I'm challenging some of their readings of the Old Testament portrayals of God.
That's a really helpful distinction. Critics from without would be people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, who look at the violent passages in the Old Testament and in some way say, this is a morally reprehensible God. He must not exist. Critics from within are those you would say would be within the broad Christian faith, but are approaching the Old Testament and taking a different approach to these passages. Tell me a little bit about how the critics from within might approach some of these difficult passages.
So one noted distinction that people like Greg Boyd and Eric Seibert make would be that there is the textual God. That is, even when it says, thus says the Lord, that this may not be what the Lord is saying, especially if it has to do with severity, harshness, quote unquote, violence. And so if God says, drive out the Canaanites according to Moses or Joshua, these critics from within would say, no, God didn't say that. That was just their fallen, ancient Near Eastern, violence-prone worldview that was superimposed on what God really intended. And so they are basically saying that Moses and Joshua are reflecting what they call the textual God, not the actual God who is revealed in Jesus Christ, especially on the cross when he says, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. So turning the other cheek, loving your enemies, that's the true character of God. That's where we should look. And if anything deviates from that, then we can call that into question as a departure from the very character of God, which is loving, kind, gracious, forgiving, loving your enemies, etc.
Helpful distinction. When we get to the end, I'm going to ask you, what is your core message to critics from without and your core message to critics from within? But we're not there yet. We'll get to it. Now, there are obviously jarring passages in the Old Testament. Everybody concedes that. And I appreciate that you say many times, these passages are troubling. Let's try to make sense of them. Now, you suggest a certain approach that we should take called, you say, with quote, charitability and the golden rule of interpretation. What does that mean?
Well, we would want people, if they were reading our writings, to read them in a charitable way, to give the benefit of the doubt, for example. And I think often people who read the Old Testament are very quick to dismiss it, quick to see what the context may be, quick to dismiss what they perceive to be a completely, it is, quick to dismiss a mindset of the ancient Near Eastern way of thinking that is totally different from theirs. And so they, because it doesn't correspond or mesh with their modern way of thinking, then they automatically get rid of it, dismiss it. And I want to say, well, take them as people who are speaking in their time, people who are, there are certain developments that we take for granted, thanks to the Judeo-Christian worldview that has shaped our civilization. And this is before we've benefited from that. So before people have benefited from that. So why not think in terms of how they would have been thinking in the kind of world in which they lived, but also understanding how God is also at work, meeting people where they are, trying to meet them, accommodate them, but also to move them in a redemptive direction. So that's really what we're talking about in terms of charitability. And so when people read, for example, Leviticus 25, and it talks about being able to take those who are from foreign nations to be your servants, and they think, oh, you can mistreat them. You can, this is like the Civil War, pre-Civil War era. No, it's not. And also, just a few chapters earlier, it says to love the alien who is in your midst, to treat him like you would a native. And so to think that the scriptures have so radically changed within 6 chapters, to say you go from loving the alien in your midst to mistreating him or something, that's not a charitable read.
I think that's a really helpful way to approach this. We have to look at the culture in which this was written, the time in which it was written, the genre and the book in which it was written. So some of these passages taken alone, of course, again, are jarring. But if we take a step back and say, what is the bigger picture going on, then we might approach it differently. So let's approach this text with some charitability. And I think that's fair. And it might be that some critics are too critical. It also might be that some Christians give too much of a pass and don't appreciate how tough some of these passages are. And I think you're trying to find that balance really well.
Right.
Now, one more question before we kind of jump into some of the particulars. You talk about how our moral instinct should or should not inform when we approach tough passages. I get asked a lot, Paul, I know you do. I've had people say to me, is there anything that could show up in the Bible that is so immoral that you wouldn't give a pass to it just because God said it, it's in the Bible? After all, there's slavery, genocide, and the command for Abraham to sacrifice his own son. Is there anything you'd see in the scripture you'd stop and say, you know what? My moral instinct trumps the scriptures. So bottom line, how do you think we should use moral instinct when looking at these difficult passages in the Old Testament?
In the first place, moral instincts are generally what we have to go on, and we are right to trust them unless we have overriding reasons to call them into question. And secondly, it's interesting that when it comes to the passage that you mentioned, Genesis 22, Abraham being commanded to sacrifice Isaac, there are critics from within who will say, yes, God commanded this, Greg Boyd. There are those who say, no, God couldn't have commanded this, Randall Rouser and Kenton Sparks. And then others who say, sorry, no, Randall Rouser say they couldn't have allowed that. And then Kenton Sparks saying, I don't know, it could have gone either way. So he wasn't sure. So the point here is that even when you've got these critics from within, they are still operating with some conflicting intuitions. Well, which is it? Well, sometimes it's not always clear. And thirdly, one important guideline here is that if these basic intuitions that we have are to be overridden, one, it would be for morally justifiable reasons being issued by a God who is good and wise, loving, holy. And also, there are certain, like when you take Isaac, for example, keep in mind that this was the promised child that God had given to Abraham and Sarah. And God said that through Isaac, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. Now, when Abraham is going to offer Isaac, he is confident that he's going to return with Isaac. And so he is going up to Mount Moriah, but before he leaves, he tells his servants, we will go and worship and we will return. So, yes, there are certain intuitions that we have, but there are also certain circumstances that also shape how we view things morally. And if there is this isn't just your ordinary conversation that's, maybe somebody has saying, God told me to do this last night. Well, Abraham has had a history with God. God has been speaking to him. God has been interacting with him. God has been promising him. And so he relocates in obedience to that promise. And so Abraham is one who is confident that God is going to come through with that promise. He's going to obey, but he knows that somehow Isaac is going to come back with him. Of that he is sure. So this radically reshapes some of that language of intuitions to remind us that, okay, there's actually something more going on. There's more in the moral picture than your ordinary circumstance, your ordinary use of intuitions. So that also has to inform us. So unless there are good reasons to override them, yes, we would say that's what we have to go on. These are moral insights. C.S. Lewis talks about these moral intuitions that we have that are kind of the beginning point. It's a clue to understanding the meaning of the universe. So that's where we begin. But it doesn't mean that there are no overriding factors that could be brought to bear upon some of these circumstances.
Let's talk about one of the apparent tensions that's in the heart of your book, which is nothing new. This actually goes way back to the early church. This sense where the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New. And you do address this in your book, but I've heard this a lot that people will say, didn't Jesus repudiate the Old Testament law? For example, he said, you heard it say eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. But I say to you, turn the other cheek, or do not resist an evildoer. So did Jesus repudiate the Old Testament, and hence there would be a distance between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New?
Right. There is a difference between Matthew 4 and Matthew 5. In Matthew 4, Jesus is quoting the scriptures from the law of Moses, and he says, it is written, it is written, it is written. That is different from what we see in Matthew 5, where Jesus says, you have heard it said, but I say to you. Jesus is not repudiating the law of Moses. In fact, what he is doing is he is addressing a misuse of the law of Moses. And we see, for example, when it comes to loving your enemies and so forth, Jesus is addressing a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation that you can love your neighbor and hate your enemies. And Jesus is repudiating that very mindset because that mindset is not found in the law of Moses. In the law of Moses, it says if your enemy's ox is stuck, you go and help your enemy. Proverbs 25 talks about if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him to drink. So Jesus is not coming up with something new. He's actually reflecting Old Testament themes, including themes in the law of Moses that regard enemy love. Jesus is addressing, when it comes to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, Jesus is not repudiating this as a legal principle of proportionality. What he is doing is he is opposing the idea that you can take vengeance on someone using this quotation in order to justify personal vindication, kind of a vigilante justice. Jesus is, in the context. I mean, Jesus in Matthew 15 talks about a just punishment for those who violate the commandments of God, which could be potentially death penalty. Hebrews chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 10 talk about just punishments, even lethal punishment, being put to death on the basis of two or three witnesses, Hebrews 10 says. So the New Testament is actually reinforcing the potential death penalty cases in the Old Testament. Rather than repudiating these, the New Testament is recognizing, well, whatever you think of the New Testament or whatever you think of the death penalty today, the New Testament authorities understood that the death penalty was something that God stood behind. And so we need to recognize that very fact. So we can go on and talk about this, but Moses is upheld in the Old Testament as someone who spoke face to face with God. He was not someone who was mishearing. In fact, Greg Boyd says that what was considered God ordained in the Old Testament could be considered demonic in the New. Well, you have no hint of that in the Old Testament. God spoke with Moses face to face. And in the New Testament, Moses was faithful in all of God's household. Hebrews tells us that Jesus said to the religious leaders about that they sit in the seat of Moses, and he tells the people to do what they say, but not to do what they do, because they're being hypocritical and so forth. So Moses is upheld as having authority, and Jesus is not tearing that down or disputing what was said. Greg Boyd takes a shot at oath taking, that this was demonic. This is from the evil one, because it's not letting your yes be yes and your no be no. But in the New Testament, you read about God swearing by his own name. You see oaths all over. God is my witness, Paul is saying. These are oaths. And so I think it's just a very selective reading of the Old Testament passages and a misunderstanding of what Jesus is doing in Matthew 5 that leads to this gross misunderstanding and distortion of Jesus' message. He is not opposing the law of Moses. He is addressing a misuse of it.
In your book in here, you've mentioned a few critics from within. You've mentioned Greg Boyd a few times. And I would say one of the things I appreciate is very respectful and congenial. You're clearly going after ideas and showing where you differ, but respectful to the people with whom you disagree. You do that really well in your book. So I don't want people to miss that approach that you're taking. Now,
and I do express appreciation for their struggling with these passages, and it's something that we're all engaging. All sides are engaging in that struggle.
And you concede points along the way, which I think is really helpful and great. Now, one of the things that comes out over and over again in your book, there must be 4 or 5 times, you'll say when we look at the person we look at the New Testament, we see things like judgment in the person of Jesus, not just in the Old Testament. So I've heard J.P. Moreland say, and I don't believe you make this point, but he'll say when anybody thinks that Jesus was not as severe, Jesus talked about hell more than anybody, which is an interesting point. You make some other points about the judgment of Jesus in Revelation and Jude, of course, in clearing the temple. Tell us why you don't think Jesus just kind of told parables and talked to kids and wandered around the countryside carrying sheep.
Yeah. Romans 11:22 is a key verse that I appeal to. It says, "Behold then the kindness and severity of God." There's a kindness as well as a harshness to God. And so, yes, we see in the cross of Christ that there is love expressed, enemy love, and we see that in the Old Testament too, that God desires for his enemies to repent and has a long-term vision that those enemies will indeed be incorporated into the people of God. But you also have Jesus who comes along echoing those themes. And so we see not only his temple cleansing, we see great severity in his parables. This will my heavenly Father do to you. So he's not just commenting about somebody in the parable, and maybe that's not really reflecting who God the Father is or the character of God is, but he is actually stepping outside the parable and then making a comment about severity. We see also Jesus, who is in the book of Revelation. The false prophetess Jezebel in Revelation 2, and Jesus threatens to cast her on a bed of sickness to give her time to repent. Also, he says, "I will strike dead her followers. Very severe. Of course, we read about the wrath of the Lamb in the book of Revelation, but we also see that Jesus, if we understand the scriptures Christologically, 1 Corinthians 10:4, that rock was Christ as they went through the Red Sea and so forth. We also see another Christological text, which is Jude 5, where the best manuscripts say Jesus, after he had led the Israelites or delivered the Israelites from Egypt, destroyed those who did not believe. So that's Jesus who is engaging in this destructive activity. So Jesus is very much involved in judgment. Indeed, the judgments of the Old Testament, that this is not some Old Testament, New Testament divide, and Jesus shows us the better way, as Marcion, who argued in the second century. The New Testament affirms significant judgment and wrath that in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 12, it's interesting that you have the angel of the Lord delivering Peter from prison, but that same angel of the Lord at the end of the chapter strikes Herod dead. So you have the hand of the Lord that comes upon Elymas and strikes him blind in Acts chapter 13. Well, in Acts chapter 11, that hand of the Lord, it says the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number believed and turned to the Lord. So the hand of the Lord can be for judgment, for goodness, and God prefers goodness. God prefers love. God prefers not to judge, but to show mercy. But there comes a point when God says, that's it. And so rather than pitting wrath and love against each other, we see that that wrath is an expression of passionate concern that God has when justice is being violated, when people are being dehumanized, when people are engaging in acts of violence and bringing harm to one another.
One more question for you before we jump into these difficult passages. And again, those of you who are watching, we're here with Dr. Paul Copan talking about his upcoming book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? If you have a critique of one of the answers that's given here, or a question about the God of the Old Testament we don't address, write it below with caps questions. We're going live next Friday, and we're going to take the toughest ones that are there. Last question before we jump into some particular passages. Morally speaking, what are some of the key differences between the law of Moses and other ancient Near Eastern laws? And I ask because this is providing the backdrop of how we jump in and even evaluate these laws in the Mosaic Law, for example. So what are just maybe a handful of the key differences that people may miss?
Yeah. Although I spend 2 chapters on this, looking at those differences, I highlight, for example, how foreigners are treated. Israel is remarkably far more humane and kind, compassionate than these other ancient Near Eastern law codes. Runaway slaves could settle in any of Israel's cities, but in the other ancient Near Eastern law codes, they would actually have extradition treaties between, say, the Babylonians and the Hittites, that if a slave ran away from a harsh master, that slave had to be returned. And if you harbored a runaway slave, you were subject to the death penalty yourself. We also see that the law of Moses is highly egalitarian. That is, there is a democratized understanding of how the law is to be applied, that there is no hierarchy, and thus a hierarchy of punishments that goes along with that. It is, as you know, in the ancient Near Eastern law codes, if you were higher up in the social ladder, then penalties were mild in comparison to those who were lower on the social ladder, as opposed to Israel, where all people were under the same law, that the law was to be applied equally, and even native and alien or foreigner had the law applied to them living in the land of Israel. So those are just a few differences that we could make, but I think there's one important shaping part of Israel's narrative that comes up over and over again, and that is 36 times in the Law of Moses, there is a reminder that the Israelites were once slaves in the land of Egypt, that they had been foreigners there, that they had been mistreated. And so that was to be a template for them, a reminder for them that those who are the most vulnerable in their society, and you see this triad come up over and over again, of the orphan, the widow, and the alien, not to abuse them, not to take advantage of them. They're the most vulnerable people in society, and so God is angry and passionate if those are going to be abused. So that is something that is very formative in the narrative of the Israelites that also gives shape to the law of Moses.
And as you point out, why is God upset at taking advantage of the widow and the orphan? Because all human beings are made in the image of God. And I appreciate that you draw this out, that when we look at these jarring passages, we got to look in the context. But remember, this is a unique Judeo-Christian idea. You don't get this from anywhere else, that every human being has dignity and value simply because they're human. That backdrop is unmistakable and must be a piece of this. All right. Are you ready, Paul, to jump into some of these tough passages?
Okay.
All right. Let's do it. So Exodus 21:15 says capital punishment for cursing parents. Let me play the skeptic. Come on, Paul. We've all done this. I mean, my kids at times have gotten upset with me. It's ridiculous to say we should go out and give capital punishment to kids for striking a parent or cursing them.
Right. Well, this isn't the sort of thing that happens on the playground or children who are, of tender age. This has to do more with someone who is misusing, as an adult, misusing the privileges of adulthood and not acting responsibly within the Israelite community and especially within his own household. But keep in mind too that while you have 16 potentially capitally punishable cases, there's only one, the general agreement with scholars here, that generally it is just one that cannot be commuted to payment, and that is cold-blooded murder, intentionally taking the innocent life of another. And so there is a general understanding that while the death penalty was possible, that generally it wasn't applied. And I in this in the Vindictive Bully book, I do modify things a little bit from my Moral Monster book and talk about how even the penalties like stoning and burning and so on, this was common language in ancient Near Eastern laws that were simply not taken as literal. And so that's one of the things that I talk about, that there is not it's a kind of a wake-up call. Don't do this. This is bad. But these penalties were not applied in that way. You do have a couple of death penalty cases in the law of Moses, but generally speaking, and I go through the history of, say, adultery and the treatment of adultery in the law of Moses, as well as beyond the law of Moses, and you just don't have those death penalty cases. A lot of this is typically handled between families. That payment is typically expected for the aggrieved party. And it's logic. Again, it's possible that there could be a death penalty, but in general, we just don't see that happening. So I make that kind of a case as well, that this is the sort of thing that we have going on, and that you have very strong exhortations and shocking sounding penalties, but these were not taken as literal in the ancient Near East.
Okay, let's shift one chapter forward to Exodus 22. And both these come right after Exodus 20, where God gives the Ten Commandments. I'm going to read these two verses. And at the end, I'm just going to ask you how, taken within itself, this can be just. And here's what it says. If a man seduces a virgin who's not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give him to her, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. I've often heard people say, wait a minute, you can just seduce a virgin and then she becomes your wife. How is this possibly just as a whole, especially to the woman?
Right. Well, in the text that you are talking about, and of course, there's a parallel in Deuteronomy as well, which looks at which looks at illegitimate sexual unions, adultery, looks at rape, and then also seduction. And keep in mind that the seduction is something that is, there is a consensuality to it, but there is a seductive element and also complicity on the part of the young woman. And so it's not as though this person has raped her. A lot of people will use that term. How could a person marry her rapist? How is that just? Well, in the Deuteronomy passage, it says if he seduces her, it's not seizes her and so forth. It's a much milder term. And also it says not if he is found out, but if they are found out. So it brings a little bit of illumination that there is a consensuality, a complicity, even though there has been seduction. And so it's not ruled out that this person could say, like Dinah, she ended up marrying someone. She had actually been, perhaps seduced. There is the question about that, but more to the point in this text, that there is seduction going on, and so there's the question: is this person, do you want to marry this person or not? And there is volition involved. It's not as though this is something forced, and it is in consultation with, say, the father. And so it is a joint decision here rather than being forced into this. But it's not as though this is someone who has just been raped in a back alley, and therefore, and then you're forced to marry someone who has just raped a stranger. That's not the sort of scenario that we see here. So it could be perhaps comparable to statutory rape, where it's maybe with a minor, but again, technically illegal. So those are the sorts of things that are going on here that are often not figured into the conversation when people look at that passage, and perhaps are shocked when they initially read it.
Let's jump back to Exodus chapter 20. And this is a question I've been asked a lot and thought about. I'm really curious your take on this. Where verse 5, it says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Taken as itself, it seems to imply that the sins of the father are carried forward to the third and fourth generation. What is that? Grandkids and maybe great grandkids. Both you and I would say it's totally fair if we were being punished for something our great grandparents or even grandparents did. So how does God get off the hook for this one?
Right. A commonly misunderstood text, and what is being said here, keep in mind there's a contrast here between a third and fourth generation, which is pretty much the lifetime of the perpetrator of the sin, and compared to however we're to interpret it, the 1,000 generations, which is kind of a lavish number of generations that God desires to show kindness rather than judgment, and that God's kindness is getting the far greater emphasis than the judgment. So this is where God would prefer to go when it comes to his covenant people. But there might be people who breach the covenant. It speaks about those who hate him, and so there is this matter of those who violate this. And then, of course, we can think just of basic consequences that come through the choices of parents, where they make decisions, and the after effects are felt for a generation or two, or maybe more. But again, it's not as though there is guilt imputed to those who are being judged by God because of what the parents have done. But rather, this is something that simply speaks of the consequences that come to those who live in the children of those who have parents who have lived in violation of this covenant, and therefore bring great dishonor, bring ruin to themselves and to those who are for whom they're to be caring. So that's really what we have going on here. And so it's not as though God is, and of course we read later on in Deuteronomy as well, as in, say, a book like Jeremiah or Ezekiel, that the individual person is going to be the one who is to be judged, that it's not on the basis of what a parent has done that will render that person guilty, but rather for what each person does, that person will be held accountable for God. The soul that sins, it will die, Ezekiel tells us.
All right, good response. Let's jump into this question, which was perhaps one of my favorite in your book, because I've taught the Old Testament, read it a million times, and you give two options to this question, and I had not ever thought of one of them, and I paused and was like, wow, how did I miss this? It's the question that I've been asked: if David was an adulterer, murderer, and polygamist, how could he possibly be a man after God's own heart?
Yeah, the typical way of handling this is, well, perhaps confusion, by thinking that, well, David is supposed to be a man after God's heart. That means that person is really maybe godly, or at least has godly desires and so forth. And therefore, this just doesn't square with the kind of behavior that David was exhibiting. What I argue, and I'm following John Goldengay here, that the more likely understanding of this is that this is according to God's own desire, that He is someone who will work according to God's purposes. So it's, someone will say, do what is in your heart. That's the idea. Do according to what your prerogatives are, what your priorities are. And so God selects David according to His own priorities. Even though David has done wrong, he's even fought in warfare. He's been a man of bloodshed, and not that not that fighting is inherently immoral, but he wanted to establish Solomon, the name meaning peace, to build the temple and so forth. So that is really what we have going on here. That this person is someone. David is one who is going to be carrying out the purposes of God. He's going to be fulfilling what is in God's heart to accomplish through, again, setting up a kingly rule and a Messiah to come, who is the son of David, to deliver the people of deliver the people of Israel, to deliver the nations, and so forth. So that's really where we ought to place our emphasis. Doesn't mean that they can't overlap in places, but that is really when you see that term used after someone's heart, that second meaning is what the author has in mind.
That's real interesting. So the phrase "a man after God's own heart" is less about David and his character, but about the role that he plays according to God's purposes.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's shift to the Exodus story. Two questions for you. And again, you go into more depth on these, and there's more questions you tackle. But I've been asked a ton, especially by students, how's it fair for God to harden Pharaoh's heart, seemingly take away his free will, cause him to do evil, and then judge him and the nation for something that God caused?
It's interesting to see where this text comes, because this mention of hardening, and of course Pharaoh hardened his own heart too. So let's not forget that.
Mm.
But God is confronting the superpower of the day, and that language of God's hardening the heart of the leader of the world superpower of the day is very significant. But we need to keep in mind too that this is not without initial self heart hardening that takes place. Before God comes to Pharaoh, it's not as though he's a really nice guy, and then all of a sudden, God hardens his heart and he becomes really nasty. No, he is nasty from the start. And he is, of course, causing this oppression in Israel. So he's already got a hard heart, and he does have he does waver periodically, pray for me, or I'll let them go, and no, I take that back. There is some kind of a wavering that is going on here. But basically, we ought to understand hardening in two stages. That first, there is a self hardening, that people resist the grace of God, and they therefore set themselves up. God says, okay, I'll let you have it your way. And so he withdraws his gracious influences and works with those who are hard hearted, and will show forth his glory and fulfill his purposes, even though this world power, this leader Pharaoh, is going to be in the middle of it. God will show how much greater he is, how much more powerful he is than the gods of Egypt, and will deliver his own enslaved people out of that land. So it's a showdown, and so God is basically, that kind of language reflects that God is in charge. God is going to accomplish his purposes, and he's going to work with a resistant ruler who has first hardened his own heart in order to bring this about.
I thought it was interesting that you said the hardening of the heart doesn't mean he's beyond salvation or repentance
Correct.
as well. What about killing of the firstborn throughout all of Egypt? You think about all these families who had nothing to do with this, and they lose their firstborn oldest child because of something Pharaoh did. That seems pretty harsh.
Right. There are a couple of considerations here. Keep in mind, the Egyptians had been involved in the attempt to get rid of the baby boys of the Israelites, of the Hebrews, that they were to be drowned in the Nile River. That you also have, as in order to sustain well, actually, we could even go on to Exodus chapter 4, where we read about Israel as God's firstborn, and that Pharaoh is seeking to do harm to God's firstborn. And as a reminder, again, this is kind of because Pharaoh has hardened his heart and so on, that God, in the 10th plague brings death to those who are the firstborn. But keep in mind that in order to keep servitude or slavery in Egypt going, this was a widespread institution. It wasn't as
Mm,
though it was just Pharaoh who is subjugating people, but others were complicit in this.
mm,
And so, in the language of the firstborn of Egypt, one, you have God saying, if you're going to do this to Hebrew babies, if you're going to do this to my firstborn, the nation of Israel, then something's going to happen to your firstborn. So we see this as something of a judgment on how Israel has been treated, by Egypt. So Egypt is getting divine judgment because it has not shown regard for God's firstborn, and so Israel's firstborn is going to receive the judgment. And this is like a last resort measure. God isn't able to get Pharaoh's attention, as it were, through these other plagues, and so finally it is in this severe judgment that finally Pharaoh gives up and says, "Okay, take your people and go." So there's a lot more to be considered in this judgment, and I even refer to some ancient uh, traditions or stories which talks about the firstborn of Egypt being struck down. So
mm.
there's a connection with the Egyptian literature of the time that had this understanding that there would be this wrathful hand against the firstborn of Egypt. So there's even perhaps some preparation for this as well. So those are a few things that perhaps are worth considering.
That's really helpful when you think about like Nazi Germany, for example. It wasn't just Hitler. There were thousands of prison guards, thousands of snitches, thousands of other people also complicit. That's a helpful point. And before reading your book, I don't know how I missed it. I had not made that connection of the Israelites, children being sacrificed and killed. In a sense, God is bringing justice back onto the new Pharaoh, what had been done to Israel. Very, very fair. Now, some of these are huge questions, and people can write their comments in with particulars, and we'll come back to them. So we could do an entire show on this. But Genesis 6 through 8, God floods the earth, men, women, and children. How is God not just smiting people in a way that just seems like complete overkill?
Right. Well, a couple of things to remember in this text. And again, there's a question about how to interpret the this this story.
Sure.
There are, so someone like William Lane Craig says, "I'm not sure what to make of the flood story," and people like John Walton and Tremper Longman will talk about how there is some sort of historical core, but in terms of where does the hyperbole or exaggeration leave off in terms of, say, the proportions of the
Sure.
ark and history, where do they leave off from each other? So there are some questions there, but more to the theological and moral point. One, the earth is filled with wickedness, with violence, and it is something that grieves God's heart. So this is something that is a part of a downward spiral. So as we look at the not just the fall in Genesis chapter 3 and Cain striking down Abel in chapter 4, we just see a decline in the human condition. We see an increase in wickedness and so forth. And so when we look at this flood scenario, one, keep in mind that this is done with a grieved heart. God is grieved about this and reluctantly sends judgment. Secondly, God is simply finishing what human beings have begun. They've gone so far down, morally speaking, that the picture is that of irretrievability. There's just no coming back. There is no redemption. There is no help for those who have sunk so low. And so God says, I'm going to finish what they have begun reluctantly. and I will start over. And so God begins, and you see the language of the new creation that comes up that echoes what goes on in Genesis 1 and 2 about the image of God, about the about the water, the waters covering the land, and so forth. And then there's a separation of the waters from the land, and so Noah and his family can disembark, etc. So, so there are some key theological themes here that do give some perspective on this challenging passage, but it's helpful to know that God is simply completing the job that human beings have done, and it's one of those last resort sorts of scenarios rather than something that God is eager to do.
One of the things you make clearly and that I want to highlight here is that if somebody wants to sanitize the Old Testament God and say that he never judges, never at times takes human life, then that's going too far. We're not trying to say God doesn't judge. You're trying to say God judges and he has compassion. It's always
Right?
both. And here's some ways to make sense of this that people often miss. Now, there's a story. I used to teach Old Testament to freshmen in high school, which was really fun when I was teaching Bible full time. And we would always talk about the story, and my students would just be like, what is going on? It's this story in 2 Samuel chapter 6 with the death of Uzzah, who reaches out to prevent the ark from falling, and it seems that God just smites him and kills him. Doesn't this show a God who's just reactionary, over the top, and maybe lacks grace?
Yeah, even David is angry.
That's right.
He's very upset about all of this. So we have on the ground reportage about what's going on. But keep in mind a few things here. One is that the ark in First Samuel chapter 4 had already been treated as a kind of a magical, a magical object that this is going to help us to defeat the Philistines. And it was to be, again, it was a false, misappropriated use of the ark to bring it into battle, and yeah, as though it was going to be some guarantee for victory when the priesthood was corrupt and so forth. But more to the point of David in Uzzah in Second Samuel, you see the same language of the ark that is to be brought forth. There's kind of a holy, set apart language that
Mm.
this is the ark where the cherubim are, where the presence of the Lord rests, and so forth. That this sacred ark is not being treated as God had prescribed. How were the Israelites to carry it? Well, the Israelites were to carry it on poles with that had rings. The ark had rings, and so the poles were to go through those rings, and it was to be carried by the Kohathites, a group of the Levites, and there was a certain prescribed manner in which this was to be done. And again, that was utterly disregarded as the ark was being transported. And David is the one who actually instigated this move, but yet didn't follow the proper protocols. And so, and even if the ark had fallen to the ground, it wouldn't have become unclean or impure or anything like that. The ground is not, unclean. It would have just been had to be picked up and put in its proper place on poles and carried by the Kohathites. So you have a misappropriation of the ark. And in fact, we read that Uzzah had himself been in the home where the ark had been. So who knows? Perhaps, and I don't want to read into this, but maybe it just became like a familiarity breeding, not contempt, but rather kind of disregard for following those protocols. And so when it came time to be moved, it was more of a casual sort of a thing. So there are a number of factors that ought to be figured in here. And of course, when we read, for example, in the Pentateuch about the sons of Aaron who are being struck down because they are using probably some pagan ritual, this strange fire that they are bringing before God in the tabernacle. God says, "I will be treated as holy by those who approach me." That is, the closer you get to God, and especially you see this in the Old Testament, the more parameters, the more barriers you had to go through because you're approaching a God who is holy, and so to treat that God with disregard, to treat God as common or casual, was utterly inappropriate for the kind of God we serve, the God who is holy above the nations, who is to be worshipped, and so forth. So those are a few considerations as we look at the broader context of what's going on in the Old Testament. That there are a number of things to keep in mind to put that was a story in proper perspective.
That's great background help to give us some context. I appreciate that. Now let's move to two of the toughest Old Testament ones because both of them, at least apparently, deal with kids. I've been asked this one a lot from 2 Kings chapter 2, where Elisha calls down bears to maul 42 children just because they call him Baldy. Now, understood that way, in any other context, you and I would say that is outrageous, that's morally egregious. How can this possibly be just for God to do such a thing through one of the key prophets in the Old Testament?
Right. The passage that is being referred to, of course, we need to keep in mind that, the Baldy portion, compared to Elijah, who was very hairy, we read in 2 Kings 1, that by contrast, his successor was, didn't have all that kind of hair. But he was also given a prophetic commission. And interestingly, he went to Jericho before going to Bethel, which was a center of idolatry. He went to Bethel, and there was contaminated water, and so through Elisha's influence, he makes the water drinkable again. And so it says that it says initially the land had been bereft, and now it was rendered fruitful. We come to the passage where these youths are, and they're not little kids. Keep in mind that David was, these terms are used of David when he was about to fight Goliath, Solomon when he became king. And also, it basically is a term used of those who are unmarried males who, again, they're old enough, teenagers, early 20s, who don't have their own household, so they're single. And keep in mind that Rehoboam, who had been the son of Solomon, when he was talking to the elders, and the elders said, "Please listen to us." Solomon was strict and harsh and so forth, and so he talks to his childhood friends, who are these youths, who are probably part of the palace entourage, part of his court. So he's not asking little kids for advice. He's asking those who are, again, the same language that's being used as we see in Second Kings chapter 2. So when Elisha is being severe, keep in mind the judgments or the punishments that are threatened to Israel if they disobey the covenant. One of them, as we read at the end of Leviticus, says that God will send wild beasts against them, and they will be bereft of their children. And that is exactly what happens. So that term bereft is used in the narrative when Elisha goes to Jericho. The land had been bereft. It had been unfruitful, and so he makes it fruitful. When he goes to this place that is a center of idolatry and is rebuffed, is mocked by these who are probably not just those who are part of the royal house, but also probably part of the temple religious system in Bethel. That they are mocking and violating the covenant because they're not listening to the prophet who's been sent from God, who, if you listen to him, will bring fruitfulness, will bring blessing. But if you resist him, there will be judgment that comes. And so it's not as though there's this cranky prophet who is annoyed with these little kids and just sends out these bears. This is the judgment of God. This is what God has promised against those who violate his covenant, who refuse to listen to his voice, that they will be bereft of their children.
That's really helpful. That again, he's not talking about children. These people had been warned. They're mocking a prophet of the Lord. and a whole lot is at stake. And again, one of the points you bring out in your book is that these stories are not prescriptive, these are descriptive of certain things that happen in the Old Testament in a certain time for a certain place. A ton more can be said about that. Maybe we'll have some questions and some pushback and we will revisit it. But one more tough one for you, and I appreciate that you tackle these, is this Psalm 137 verse 9, where it says, how blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes your little ones against the rock. And if I'm not mistaken, some translations say your children or your babies, dashing them against rocks. How could you make a song and seemingly celebrate anybody dashing kids against rocks? So what's your take on the imprecatory Psalms?
Okay, two questions there. The take on the imprecatory Psalms, I'll start there. The imprecatory Psalms, again, these are prayer curses that are part of the Old Testament and can be, again, very severe sounding. And keep in mind that this is part of the ancient Near Eastern culture, even in today's Middle East. You see this very strong kind of language that, again, it's black and white. There is no in between. There is no nuancing. It's very, very severe language. But we see that, some people say, well, doesn't Jesus command us to love our enemies? Yes, he does. But interestingly, we see in the New Testament imprecatory psalms that are quoted as well. So it's not as though we lose with the gospel, we lose any relevance of these imprecatory psalms, but rather we see less emphasis in the New Testament on cursing and more on blessing and so forth. But it's not as though cursing or judgment goes away. When Judas is being replaced in Acts chapter 1, two imprecatory psalms are being quoted. Let his place be made desolate. Let another take his office. Paul quotes from Psalm 109 Psalm 69 in Romans chapter 11, where again an imprecatory psalm is being utilized in judgment against those who are unbelieving Israelites. And so again, keep that in mind, that it's not as though these imprecatory psalms are just part of the Old Testament and that's it. They have enduring relevance. But when it comes to the matter of the Psalm 137, let me just jump into that. There are at least four different interpretations of how to understand this. One is that it's simply the psalmist speaking out of emotional rage. Here they've been transplanted from and taken from their land. They're being mocked. Sing us one of your songs of Zion, will you? And also the Babylonians have been helped by the brothers of the Israelites, namely the Edomites, who have led these fugitives into the hands of the Babylonians. So there's like a double slam against the Israelites, the Judahites, who have been in exile. But so there is rage, there is anger, and the Psalms do reflect that emotional outcry. But also the languages could be simply reflecting, this is the kind of thing that the Babylonians did to us, and that's the kind of language that Isaiah 13 uses. That this is what the Babylonians did too. They're those who have been their enemies when they have come into town, and so it could be, Lord, pay them back, do to them what they have done to us. Also, it could be referring to it's not little children, but actually those who are part of the royal house, and it's a cry for the royal line to be discontinued, for God to bring judgment on the royal line. Some interpreters see these as soldiers. That these are the children. So when you're talking about the daughter of Babylon, it's not as though this is some sort of a woman losing her children. This is the power. This is the nation that is in charge, that is dominating other nations. So when you look at it in terms of oppression, when you look at it in terms of calling for an end to oppression, that's the direction which we should go. And I spell out some of the other options in the book, but I think that's probably all we have time for here.
No, that's great. And that's super helpful, by the way. I thought the example you gave at the end, you said, what if somebody, a father had his daughter kidnapped by radical Muslims and just brutalized? An imprecatory psalm by some would be a way of crying out for justice and humanly expressing the despair and the anguish, which is not inconsistent with ultimately hoping that that person would repent and come to grace. I think it's hard for us to understand these imprecatory psalms because we only pick out songs that are happy and joyful, yet a lot of psalms are lament psalms, imprecatory psalms. Again, the whole counsel of God we find when we look in the scriptures. Paul, your endurance is awesome. 4 more for you. You are killing it here. No pun intended. But good job. Had to throw that in there. 4 more. Obviously, there's a ton more you cover. Your book is 260 pages, so you cover these in more depth than we're covering here. A lot of issues we don't bring up, but we are inviting tough questions, responses to what you've said here, and also new questions from the Old Testament. Just write in the comments question as succinct as you can, and we'll try to take as many as we can when we come back live next Friday. Okay, like I said, 4 more for you. A big topic you cover is polygamy in the Old Testament. Now, you say a lot of things about this, but in particular, address this passage I was asked about recently, where in 2 Samuel chapter 12, God says to David that he is giving him his master's house and, quote, your master's wives into your care. Does that seem to be an endorsement of polygamy?
Some people think it is. And I know that there are evangelical scholars who say that, not necessarily this passage, but that polygamy is permitted. Like David Lamb would disagree that polygamy is being endorsed here by God, but rather he would say that this would be a condition that was tolerated and not rendered, against, in violation of the law of Moses. I do think that Leviticus 18:18. Where it shifts from, and you can see this in the Hebrew text, where it shifts very clearly from these sexual relationships with those who are close, like incestuous relationships, to those outside of that circle. And I think that this is where kind of a turning point where a man is married and takes a rival wife, the same kind of language that's used in First Samuel 1, where you have Elkanah, who has a rival wife. He has his wife Hannah, but also Peninnah, and of course there's rivalry there. And so Hannah is very dismayed by all of this. But there's that picture of a rival wife, not biological sisters, but rather a fellow Israelite woman who is taken in as a wife. So what do we have here? Well, we have, I think, in Second Samuel 12, we have God telling David after, of course, the incident with the gross act of immorality with Bathsheba, and also putting Uriah, her husband, on the front lines of the battle and having him killed. God is saying that you, of course, after you took this little lamb that belonged to someone else, and it's like you're the rich man who is taken from a poor man's household, taking that little lamb that he loved, and you took it to feed your guest who had so much. And so what you have, this household shift that was common in the ancient Near East, where you would have the entourage, everything that belonged to one king would just be transferred to the palace of the incoming king. And that was just how it worked. But if we take this literally, this just raises some questions. And again, if you take the polygamy is permitted view, I mean, plenty of Old Testament scholars, evangelical scholars do see that. But it seems that there are a couple of things that are out of order. One is that if David is taking this household, these wives of Saul, as his own wives, for example, and engages with them sexually, presumably, as the argument goes, well, then one of them would be his own mother-in-law, Ahinoam, Saul's wife, because he married Michal, the daughter, and so this would be considered an immoral act, a criminal act according to the law of Moses, Leviticus 18. Furthermore, if we use that language of give, and I think we can see this as being a loose way of speaking, that God is saying, I would have given you these types of things. And so when he's talking about giving, he also mentions David's son Absalom, his opponent, who will rise up And God is going to give these concubines, these women into Absalom's bed. So, and that's what happens to humiliate David. He has sexual relations with these women in David's palace. The problem is here is God giving is God saying, I'm giving you these for your adulterous pleasures? No, of course not. So we got incest and, again, adultery that would be presumably endorsed by God. So I'm just raising some questions. I don't think that is strictly what's going on here. So maybe there's another way of looking at it. And so I think that the scales would tip toward God. Well, one, not endorsing polygamy anyway. In fact, if you look at polygamy in the Old Testament, if this is something that is just as good as any other arrangement, it's actually a terrible advertising campaign for polygamy. It's just you see a mess all over the place where you see polygamy, strife, and jealousy, and so forth. So it's really it's not a good way of going about things just from a practical point of view. But anyway, that's all I'll say about that passage.
That's really fair. I appreciate that you recognize that Old Testament scholars differ and apologists might offer different responses. Some that God permitted this for a season, others that would say, like when they were put into his care, it doesn't mean to use in terms of sexually, but to care for them as human beings. There's some interpretation that takes place here. Here's another tough one I've been asked. This is in the book of Numbers, where it seems to imply, when read a certain way, that the Israelites could take sex slaves left over from winning a battle. And I'll read Numbers 31:18, then you can jump in here, Paul. It says, but all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. So it seems to me that if they haven't lied with a man, you can keep them alive and just use them for yourself. Is that a correct understanding?
Well, a couple of things. One is that the presumption in Israel was that sexual relations was to be within a marriage context. Of course, we see the biblical vision for that spelled out in Genesis 2:24. For this cause, a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And so this is the presumption that the leaving and then the cleaving and then the one flesh, that's the order of things. And we see that actually in Deuteronomy, where you have the passage in Deuteronomy 21 where there is a woman who is taken as a prisoner of war who can become a wife to, say, an Israelite soldier. But there has to be a marriage ceremony first, but even before that, there has to be a waiting period of a month before that is undertaken. So she takes off her old clothes, puts on new ones. She's in mourning. She shaves her hair, clips her nails to show a separation from her previous way of life, her culture, her family, and that she is going to be embarking on another one. This is a very humane, kind, gracious, compassionate way of arranging things. It's not war rape, which you do see with other nations, Assyria, Egypt, and so forth. That is not taking place within Israel. That was not an appropriate sexual expression. It had to be within the context of marriage. But more to the point, I think if we look at the broader context, we see that Moses. Well, I mean, maybe that's. I don't know. I could go into more detail. I spend a number of pages looking at that passage in chapter 31 of Numbers. So I devote a number of pages to it, and I think some helpful insights that will come from that. But maybe I'll just leave it at that for now.
I think that's good. I appreciate that you spent a number of pages on Numbers 31. Well said. I've got one more from you and then a couple broad questions. Now, this one, you spend pages on your first book on this. Again, is God a Moral Monster? You revisit it again in this book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? By the way, great titles for both of the books. Separate issue. But you talk about slavery. Now, again, we can't remotely do this justice. But tell us just maybe one or two or a couple key points you draw out, maybe even related to whether or not we should use the term slavery when talking about the practice we see in the Old Testament.
Slavery, when it's mentioned in Scripture, a lot of people assume that this is talking about something that's tantamount to antebellum slavery in the U.S. South. And that is certainly not the case at all. There were provisions for those who are servants. I think servant is a better term. And it is a neutral term too. It could simply mean worker, but is often related to a contractual arrangement that comes out of poverty. And so a person will sell himself or sell his family, as it were, into servitude because they have no option. So it's basically, when you talk about selling yourself, it's a contractual sort of a thing, and that you just say, I'm going to be an indentured servant until I can pay off my debt. Again, maximum being 6 years. That you do that unless you align yourself to the person for whom you're working. You say, I love my master, my employer, and you align yourself with that person permanently. Now, when it comes to Leviticus 25, keep in mind that language, it says you may, again, not you must, but you may obtain or acquire servants from foreign nations. And again, that language of the sojourners and foreigners or aliens in your midst, that's repeated throughout Leviticus 25. In fact, the Israelites themselves are called that earlier in the chapter. But a lot of people stop there, and they don't go on to say verse 47, which talks about if one of these aliens or sojourners is becomes a person of means, then that person, the Gentile, the foreigner, can acquire, same word that's used earlier, can acquire an Israelite who may sell himself to this person. Again, so we're talking about legal transaction here, and we're also talking about foreigners who can come into work, initially starting out as perhaps servants, attaching themselves to households in Israel, and then becoming persons of means so that they can actually hire an Israelite for themselves to work. But that's not ideal, and so there are ways of avoiding that, redeeming that person by a relative so that he can be within an Israelite household. But it's interesting that David Kleins, who's a noted Old Testament scholar, talks about this. He says there are two texts. One is Deuteronomy 23, which talks about a foreigner, a foreign runaway slave, I mentioned earlier, who comes and he's allowed to settle in any of Israel's cities. So there is freedom to, again, if you can get away from a harsh master, to find a place of refuge. Israel is your place. So if it's true about the foreigner, how much more for the Israelite servant? But also the passage from Exodus 21, that a person who has been working as a servant can actually say, I really love this arrangement. In fact, John Goldengay says that to be a servant in an Israelite household is actually to be part of the family, and that you could actually love the person for whom you're working and say, I want to be with you forever. So basically, if you got the possibility of one, running away, secondly, of attaching yourself to someone and being his servant perpetually, this basically guts that whole idea of slavery as an institution, and really makes it very humane, makes it very compassionate, and so forth. So basically, David Klein says these two texts fundamentally undercut any notion of, say, some harsh institutionalized slavery, because you've got ways out of them. You can be freely involved, you can run away, or you can attach yourself to someone permanently. And so he sees this as very significant, and so do I.
Well, that's awesome. And you make a ton more points in this, but we're back to one of the early points you made, that we've got to be careful judging these passages by certain modern ideas. We might come with a different response, go back to the culture at that time, and we would see these passages very, very differently. Now, again, you talk about critics from within and critics from without. Let's kind of bring this full circle. Critics from without, again, people like Richard Dawkins, skeptics who look at these passages and say they can't worship or follow or believe in such a God because these things are so just starkly immoral. What's a few things you might say to critics from without?
First, I'd say distinguish between the broader vision of the Old Testament and the laws that might come within Israel. Of course, Jesus said that certain laws were permitted because of the hardness of human hearts, not because these were ideal. And as N.T. Wright says, that the law of Moses is seen as something of a booster rocket to get Israel into proper, just properly established, so as to make sense of the coming Messiah who would fulfill all of these longings, fulfill these sacrifices, these other institutions, etc. And so keep that in mind, that there's a difference between the vision and the specific laws. There's also important to keep in mind that God begins where people are And so he is not coming into an ideal situation. There's a lot of messiness, there's a lot of brokenness. And so rather than waiting until a pristine situation comes up, God steps in, gets his hands dirty, and works with the people, works with a situation where there's warfare, where there's harshness, severity, and so forth. And so God steps into that. But keep in mind that he is moving the Israelites, his people, into a redemptive direction. And so when Jesus comes, he comes from outside of the realm of power, outside in Bethlehem rather than into Jerusalem. And so God works through powerlessness. He works through weakness. Of course, in the death on the cross of Jesus, that he willingly gives himself to die for the sake of humanity, for his enemies. But keep in mind that this doesn't mean that there's an end to divine severity. It still continues. But what I'm trying to do with the Old Testament, with those who are critics of the Old Testament God from outside, the Dawkins types, is to remember that God is actually more compassionate and gracious than you may realize. And this pertains to Jesus too. We see Jesus, who is first of all, he is one who will not snuff out a smoldering wick or break a bruised reed, but he will also rule the nations with a rod of iron. So you see both in Jesus. And a lot of people who say, yeah, get me out of the Old Testament, let me go to Jesus. Well, there is still a severity with Jesus, so let's not forget that. And that's really the point that I'd carry over now to the critics from within. That whereas the critics from without will emphasize the harshness and severity of God, I want to say, hold on a minute, there's a context to consider in the ancient Near East where God is stepping into a messy situation, but also that God is more compassionate than you may realize, that God desires to show mercy rather than wrath. And then to those who are the critics from within, who want to downplay divine severity, I say, no, the severity is still there. It doesn't go away with Jesus. And that we need to try to find the right balance. We need to try to find the right position. Again, we're still kind of struggling to get to that point. But as a friend of mine, Robert McQuilkin, said that it's always easier to go to a consistent extreme than to stay at the center of biblical tension. And that's what I'm trying to do. You can read it and judge for yourselves to think if I've gotten close to that. But that's what I'm trying to approximate at any level, and not to create these sorts of extremes or to distinguish between the textual God and the actual God. I think that that's not doing justice with the text, because when you read those who are doing this sort of differentiation, there's a lot of actually selectivity or cherry picking that's going on, unfortunately, and I try to point that out in the book.
Well, you do well, truthfully, but also, again, charitably. You encourage people to read the Old Testament charitably, but even critics from within and critics from without, you consistently treat them with charity, critique ideas, but I found you gracious towards people, which is why not only love you as a friend, but just you're such a good apologist, Paul. I want to encourage you. I appreciate your commitment to truth, the research you do. I don't know how you write so many books. People say that about me, and I'm like, what about my friend Paul, man? He's pumping out stuff more than I do that's top caliber. So I hope people right now, at the time of this release, it's not available. You can pre-order it. It's out in just a few weeks. And whether you're a critic from within, a critic from without, or sympathetic, you'll find it interesting, well-researched, and just well worth your time. Now, this is not the end. In some ways, your book is 260 pages. And on some of these issues, we just scratched the surface, but there's a lot of issues we didn't even address. There's probably some people watching this going, what about this passage in the Old Testament? For example, we didn't even talk about Old Testament violence, and there's actually a reason for that, because your whole first book is focused on that, and there's enough other passages to deal with. So again, wherever you're at, write in. Any comment is welcome, but write in question in caps, and then as succinctly as you can, state your question. If it's a passage we didn't address from the Old Testament, or if you don't buy one of the answers that are given here, state it there. We're coming back live next Friday. This will be September 30th at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We will be streaming this live. And Paul, I'm going to feed you as many of these questions as we can and get your responses to them. So I am super looking forward to that. And again, those of you watching, this is brought to you by Biola Apologetics. Make sure you hit subscribe. If you've ever thought about getting a distance degree in apologetics, we would love to train you. And you can tell by this video, we take on some of the toughest issues, not shying away from them, but wanting to do it with kindness and with winsomeness. And I don't know anybody who does that better than our guest today, Dr. Paul Copan. So Paul, prepare yourself. I will be sending you some of these tough questions, but I'm already looking forward to next Friday.
Very good. Looking forward to it. Thanks so much, Sean. A blessing to be with you.
You too.